Welcome! Today we're breaking down a really important systematic review and meta-analysis that was published in the Lancet Psychiatry. This paper takes a hard, rigorous look at the highest quality scientific evidence we have for using cannabinoids to treat mental health and substance use disorders. And this explainer gets right to the heart of a huge question. You see, the use of medical cannabinoids is just soaring, and mental health conditions are one of the main reasons people get prescriptions. So the question is the clinical practice getting way ahead of the scientific proof? So, to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to follow the structure of the paper itself. We'll start with the problem, the evidence gap. Then we'll look at the methods they used. After that, we'll dive deep into the results, what works and what doesn't. And finally, we'll wrap up with the clinical bottom line. Okay, so let's start by framing the central issue here. Medical cannabinoids are authorized in a lot of places around the world, and literally millions of people are using them for their mental health. But, and this is a big but, there's this growing concern about the gap between how much they're being used and what we actually know they can do based on solid science. This study, well, it aims to bridge that very gap. So, how in the world do you find definitive proof? Well, the researchers here didn't just go out and do one new study. Nope. Instead, they did something called a meta-analysis. They basically gathered up all the existing, high-quality evidence from what we consider the gold standard of medical research, the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. And the scale of this review, it's just immense. We're talking about data from 54 different trials, with nearly 2,500 participants, all told. But here's the crucial part. They didn't just mash all the data together. They carefully assessed its quality using really stringent tools, like the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool. This helps them figure out not just if there was an effect, but how certain we can actually be about that finding. All right, now for the core of the whole analysis. What did the data actually show when it was all pulled together? We're going to go through the results for each major category of disorders that the paper looked at. Think of this slide as our roadmap for the results. Up top, you've got a small group of conditions where they found a statistically significant benefit. In the middle, there's a much bigger group where, well, no real benefit was seen. And down at the bottom, there was one condition where symptoms actually got worse. So let's break each of these down. Okay, so here we see some of the positive signals. For insomnia, cannabinoids did increase sleep time. For tic syndrome, they saw reduced tic severity. And for autism spectrum disorder, a reduction in autistic traits was noted. But, and you knew there was a but coming, the researchers added a crucial caveat. They graded the certainty of this evidence as moderate to very low. That means we can't be all that confident that the real effect isn't substantially different. And this next part, it just brilliantly illustrates the complexity of all this. For cannabis use disorder, a mix of CBD and THC did seem to help with withdrawal. For opioid use disorder, though, no significant effect. And then, get this, for cocaine use disorder, cannabinoids actually led to a significant increase in craving compared to placebo. It just goes to show you, these compounds aren't a monolith. Their effects can vary dramatically. So this is a really crucial point. For some of the most common reasons people seek out medical cannabinoids, we're talking psychosis, anxiety, and PTSD. This huge analysis, looking at the highest quality evidence we have to date, found no significant benefit on symptoms when compared to a placebo. And let's just pause on this next one because it's a truly striking finding. For depression, one of the most common reasons people self-report using medical cannabinoids, the researchers found zero, not one, zero randomized controlled trials that met their standards. That's not just a gap in the evidence, it's a complete void. Efficacy is only half the story. So now let's flip the coin over and look at safety. We also need to take a really close look at the overall quality of the research that all of these conclusions are based on. All right, let's talk about a really key safety metric. It's called the number needed to treat to harm, or NNTH. For cannabinoids, that number is 7. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that for every 7 patients you treat with cannabinoids, one of them will experience an adverse event that they wouldn't have had if they were on a placebo. The overall odds of having any kind of adverse event were about 1.75 times higher. Now, it's important to note the most common side effects were pretty mild. We're talking dry mouth, nausea, and dizziness. But this next part is a vital distinction. While those minor side effects were more common, the meta-analysis found no statistically significant difference in serious adverse events, like a psychotic episode. It also found that people weren't more likely to drop out of the studies, which suggests the treatments were generally pretty well tolerated, at least in these clinical trial settings. Now, this might be one of the most important findings for putting everything into context. A full 44%,
So nearly half of all the trials they included were judged to have a high risk of bias. What that means is the studies had flaws in their methods that could have distorted the results. The bottom line, our confidence in a lot of these findings is low, and the true effect is probably different from what was estimated.
So, after all that, what does this actually mean for doctors, for patients, for policymakers? Let's put it all together and get to the final clinical takeaway from this massive paper. Okay, here's the real-world implication. This evidence gap creates a pretty significant clinical risk. And it's not just about side effects. The risk is that prescribing cannabinoids when we don't have strong data could actually delay or replace therapies that are already established and we know are highly effective, things like cognitive behavioral therapy or other approved medications. The authors of the study themselves give a clear and pretty unambiguous conclusion based on everything they analyzed. They state that given the scarcity of high-quality evidence and the increased risk of adverse events, the routine use of cannabinoids for these conditions is, at present, rarely justified. So where does all this leave us? Well, this review doesn't necessarily say that cannabinoids don't work. What it's really saying is that the high-quality evidence to prove they do is, for the most part, missing. And that creates an urgent need for better, bigger, and more rigorous research to finally close this gap between widespread clinical use and the solid scientific evidence that patients and doctors truly deserve.